present. We are also live on Facebook. Everyone present there also to with me. This is the first session of the special discussion series of Voices from the Periphery. It is my privilege to welcome Mr. Sarbpreet Singh today. Sarbpreet Singh is a distinguished writer, playwright, podcaster, and commentator whose work spans literature, history, and Sikh heritage. He is the acclaimed author of Kultar's Mine, a powerful poetic exploration of the 1984 Sikh genocide, The Camel Merchant of Philadelphia, an evocative historical narrative, The Night of the Restless Spirits, a poignant collection of short stories centered on the events of 1984, and The Story of the Sikhs, a masterfully crafted storytelling of Sikh history. His latest novel, The Sufi's Nightingale, beautifully reimagines the life and times of the revered Sufi poet Shah Hussain. Additionally, he is the author of Jhujar Chima, a brilliant adaptation of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, set against the turbulent backdrop of Punjab in the early 1990s. Singh is also the creator and narrator of the Story of Sikhs podcast, a groundbreaking series that has captivated listeners across 90 countries. Now, in its fourth season, the podcast's sweeping historical depth and narrative brilliance have drawn comparisons to the work of legendary filmmaker Ken Burns. Beyond his literary and scholarly contributions, Singh is the founder of the Gurmat Sangeet Project, a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving the rich and sacred musical traditions of Sikhism. His insightful commentary has been featured on esteemed platforms such as the BBC and National Public Radio, and his writings have appeared in leading newspapers across the United States, India, and Pakistan. Through his diverse body of work, Sarbpreet Singh continues to illuminate history, culture, and spirituality with profound intellectual excellence. I will now invite Ash to moderate the session.
Thank you, Shantan, for the brief introduction. And good evening, sir, and good evening to all of our who joins us and who are from Facebook. We are happy to announce our first special lecture on this interesting and wonderful topic today. So now I will request to sir, please over to you, sir. You can now.
Thank you. Thank you for that very generous introduction and the invitation as well. So today, let me just provide an overview of what I'll be discussing. I'll start by briefly talking about my personal engagement with 1984, and then I will spend the bulk of our time today 40 years after the violence, it behooves us to ponder on the legacy of 1984 and how we deal with 1984 moving forward. There is considerable confusion in terms of why Sikhs are unable to, quote, move on and forget about 1984. So I will talk about why Sikhs are never going to forget the violence of 1984. And then I'll provide a bit of a historical perspective on the Sikh response to tyranny. And then I will offer some thoughts about moving forward and breaking the cycle of sectarian violence, again, drawing largely upon the Sikh tradition. And then finally, I will finish with a brief reading from my collection of short fiction on 1984 called The Night of the Restless Spirits. So let me start by talking about how I engaged with 1984 personally. When the events of November 1984 occurred, I was a final year student at BITS Pilani studying engineering. So Pilani is a very quiet place several hours away from Delhi. And we were mostly insulated from what was happening in Delhi and in places like Kanpur and Bokaro and elsewhere. There were some disturbances on the campus, but they were kind of isolated. And I remember there was a certain pervasive narrative which, went on to become the mainstream narrative in the years to follow. And the narrative roughly went like this. Now, I see a few photographs, and of the participants. Most of you are very young. You were not born during these events. And in any case, 1984 is not a topic that is widely discussed in Indian media today and has not been for the past 4 decades. There's really no need for me to sort of do a deep dive into the facts of 1984 because those are well documented, and you can read about them from multiple sources. Of course, when the events were occurring, these were we were many years before the internet, and the only sources of information at that time were All India Radio, Doordarshan, and mainstream press. Doordarshan and All India Radio had a carefully controlled government directed narrative. And the press was also either censored or self-censored in the quote unquote national interest. It was very important to propagate a certain narrative. And this narrative I completely bought into as well as a young Sikh man. So very briefly, without getting into a lot of detail about the history, the violence of 1984 was perpetrated as a consequence of the assassination of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, who was shot dead by 2 of her Sikh bodyguards. And the broader context of this was an invasion of the most important Sikh shrine, the Sri Harmandir Sahib, popularly known as the Golden Temple, which had occurred a few months earlier in June. So it was an act of vengeance directed at Mrs. Gandhi for ordering the attack on the Golden Temple. Now, the history leading up to the attack on the Golden Temple is tremendously complicated, and it's not our topic today. We don't have time to delve into it. Suffice it to say that the Sikhs had been agitating against the central government for more than a decade. The agitation had turned violent, and that was the pretext that was used to attack the Sri Harmandir Sahib, which is largely acknowledged as one of Mrs. Gandhi's worst mistakes in power, with the benefit of hindsight that we have today. But that's the very direct context of the violence of 1984. Now, as a young man who had been raised far from Punjab, I grew up in Sikkim, as far removed from Punjab and Punjabi culture, and really the Sikh faith, as one can possibly be on the Indian subcontinent. I had very little identification with my roots, so to speak. And honestly, the events of 1984 didn't bother me tremendously at that time, which might seem strange as I was a young Sikh man, but that's where the narrative that I was talking about, has to be brought to the forefront. The narrative was roughly like this. Terrible violence occurred in Delhi in particular over more than 4 days when mobs rampaged with impunity, pulling Sikhs out of their home, murdering them, raping women, looting, with the police either idly standing by or at some times actively abetting the so-called rioters. Now, I remember at that time, nobody in their right mind said, what happened to the Sikhs of Delhi and Sikhs elsewhere in Kanpur, Bokaro, and other places that experienced violence? Nobody said it was a good thing. Nobody even said it was okay. But deep in their hearts, a lot of people believed that, what's happened is terrible, but the Sikhs kind of asked for it. Because of the agitation, because of their opposition to the central government and the agitation which had been continuing for more than a decade. How can I say this with such confidence? Well, that's what I believed. And it's no surprise because my context, my source of information was also everyone's source of information. Doordarshan, All India Radio, and the press, which all uniformly characterized what had happened in Delhi in 1984 as a riot. So, this game of semantics that was played was so insidious that today, 40 years after the violence of 1984, the most well intentioned amongst us still refer to the events as a riot, even though today we know that it was no such thing. 1984. I'm a young man. I graduate from college. I spend a couple of years working in Mumbai, and then I go to the US for grad school. Now, all exiles, voluntary or otherwise, at some point start searching for their roots, and I was no exception. I had never been connected to my roots, but after leaving my context, as is often the case, I started educating myself about the history of the Sikh faith and various other things. And that's what brought me once again to the events of 1984. Now we're talking 4 years after the fact, 87, 88. I'm a young graduate student in the US. I was prompted to teach myself about 1984. So I was studying computer science. My university library was not very rich when it came to, the humanities and social sciences. But still, I went in and I started looking at news footage. And I read a lot of international reporting about the events of 1984. And I ended up scratching my head a little because what I read in the international press was very different from what I'd read in the Indian press. I was a skeptical young man. And, at that time, at least in India, we had this notion that the Western press is very unfair. India is always characterized unfairly. And so I took these reports with a grain of salt. And then, somewhat serendipitously, I was introduced to a few documents which were not in circulation in India. The first one was a report published by two human rights organizations in India, the PUCL and the PUDR, titled "Who Are the Guilty?" This is, by the way, widely available now on the internet. At that time, it was banned in India, and I got a hold of a copy in the US. I read it, and it boggled my mind. The reason was that the narrative in this report, which seemed to be very well done, meticulously documented, very detailed, based on interviews, the narrative in the report was completely at odds with the narrative that was in my head. Because the report claimed that far from being a riot, what happened in Delhi was a carefully organized massacre. My first response was to go look at the authors of the report. Was this some kind of propaganda put out by Sikhs with a certain agenda? So when I looked at the authors of the report, I discovered that it had been prepared under the aegis of Justice Tarkunde, who had retired as the Chief Justice of the Bombay High Court. And most of the people who had penned the report were non-Sikhs. More head-scratching. What was going on? Why was this narrative so different from the one that I had been exposed to? And then I stumbled upon an article written by Madhu Kishwar, who used to edit a progressive magazine called Manushi. In sharp contrast to a lot of her colleagues in the media, Madhu Kishwar had penned a fearless article titled Gangster Rule, in which she had reported on what she had seen in Delhi during those days of violence. And much to my surprise, everything in Madhu Kishwar's article matched the PUCL PUDR reports almost 100%. That created a tremendous amount of turmoil in my heart, because the narrative that I had carried with me for several years after the massacre now seemed suspect. And then I chanced upon an academic paper written by a Delhi professor, Dr. Veena Das, who had studied several of the children who had survived 1984. And she had written an article about how these children dealt with their PTSD. All of them had their fathers and their male relatives killed. Several women in their families had been molested. These children had suffered terrible trauma, and Dr. Das poignantly told the stories of several of these children. So that's when I was first prompted to write about 1984. The turmoil in my heart poured out in the form of a long poem called Kultar's Mime, which told the story of four children who had suffered through the massacre and talked about their PTSD and how they dealt with their PTSD. So that's when my personal engagement with 1984 started. Well, I was a young man. I was at the start of my career. I graduated from college, continued with my professional career. Several decades passed. The poem that I had written and a few short stories that I had written on the subjects, essentially I never made an attempt to publish them. But 30 years later, after I had written the poem, my daughter, who was a first-year student at college in the US, decided to take the poem and turn it into a play called Kultar's Mime. And the short version is that for the next 2.5 years, my daughter and I spent our time essentially touring this play about 1984 around the world. By the time we were done, we had performed it 90 plus times. We had taken it to 6 countries, including India. We took it twice to India, performed it initially in Delhi and Punjab, and then came back and performed it in all the major metros. So that was my personal engagement with 1984. And I have to tell you, since we had talkbacks after all of our performances, it became very apparent to me that the trauma of the Sikh community had been buried very deep. At that time, this was a decade earlier, so 30 years had passed since the massacre. And as we toured, remember, this was not ancient history. Every audience had audience members who had either directly experienced the violence of 1984 or had been touched by it because of their families. And the stories started coming out. The tears started pouring out. I heard some harrowing personal stories that people had buried for more than 30 years as we toured, as we toured the world with Kultar's Mime. Somewhere along the journey, prompted by the response to the play, I decided to give up my professional career. I had been working initially as an engineer, developer of technology, and then as an executive in the tech industry, managing various technology businesses. I decided to quit my tech career, and I focused myself exclusively on storytelling. So that was the genesis of my second career, if you will, as a writer. Subsequent, a few years after the Kultar's Mime tour had ended, I took some of the short stories that I had written more than 35 years ago, wrote a few more, and published The Night of the Restless Spirits, which is an examination of 1984 from many, many different angles. So this has been my personal journey in the context of 1984. And the one sort of key thing that I want particularly the young people on the call to take away from this is 1984 is not a subject that is often discussed, in the context of either the media or history in India. It's a very inconvenient chapter in history. There's no upside to anyone talking about this. The government certainly doesn't want to talk about it. Sikhs have buried this trauma very deep. And being a small minority, there's tremendous pressure on the Sikh community to quote unquote move on. So the upshot is that there is this tremendous unaddressed trauma which has lingered over the years. Now, the one ray of light that was, that I became aware of during the Kultar's Mime tour was the response of people to the play, particularly, particularly all over India, particularly outside of Punjab. Now, as I had expected, the reaction to the play was very powerful and very emotional in Delhi, in Punjab, because, these places have a large Sikh population. But to my astonishment, when we performed the play in Mumbai, when we performed the play in Chennai, in Kolkata, in Bangalore, it was amazing for me to see that the reaction of non-Sikh audiences was not an iota different. The same pain, the same tears, the same empathy. And what that taught me was, forget about those who walk the corridors of power. The empathy of the common man is alive and well. And I think that we should take a great deal of hope from that. Let me now switch tracks and talk about a few important questions to ponder 40 years after the violence of 1984. The first one, which I am often asked: why can Sikhs not move on beyond 1984? And this question is often asked by very well-meaning people. People are not accusing the Sikhs of anything. They're just a little perplexed that 40 years have passed. Why do the Sikhs persist in talking about 1984? So this is where it's important to go back to history, particularly the history of the turbulent 18th century. This was a time, so we go to the early 18th century. The 10th Sikh Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, has passed away, and the northern part of the subcontinent is in terrible turmoil. The reason for the turmoil is the Mughal Empire is starting to decline. In 1739, Nadir Shah of Persia attacks Hindustan, sacks Delhi, decamps with a tremendous amount of treasure, and finally breaks the back of the Mughal Empire, which had already been declining after the death of Aurangzeb, and now the empire starts declining precipitously. Punjab is one of the 22 provinces of the Mughal Empire. It's always been extremely wealthy, extremely important, a huge producer of revenue. But the Mughal control over Punjab now starts slipping. And one of the biggest catalysts to that is the rise of a lieutenant of Nadir Shah's, Ahmad Shah Abdali, who, after Nadir Shah is assassinated, decamps with a lot of his treasure looted from India and sets up his own kingdom in Afghanistan. Over the next several decades, Ahmad Shah Abdali is to attack Hindustan 9 times. And who bears the brunt of his invasions? Of course, the Punjabis, because that's the path that every invader has taken since time immemorial. This was the context in which the Sikhs, who, as those of you who have even a little sense of Sikh history will know, these were largely people drawn from the bottom part of the pyramid that was India's caste hierarchy, a people who had been oppressed for millennia, now were in the middle of this hotbed of violence as Ahmad Shah Abdali and the fading Mughal Empire essentially played tug of war, with Punjab being sort of the theater. So there were various times when the Afghans took control of Punjab. At one point, Punjab was formally ceded to Ahmad Shah Abdali by the Mughal Emperor Ahmad Shah, the son of Muhammad Shah Rangile, who was defeated by Nadir Shah. So the result was that there was tremendous chaos in the Sikh homeland, the Punjab, for several decades. And during this chaos, when there was repression by Mughal governors such as Zakaria Khan, such as Mir Mannu or Mainil Mulk, and on the other side by the rampaging Afghans, the only people who stood up to either of these two forces were the Sikhs. Why they stood up to them, I will address in a few minutes, but the important thing is that they were the only ones who opposed tyranny from both sides, and they suffered tremendous consequences. Sikhs were mercilessly massacred by the governor of Lahore, Zakaria Khan, and then the subsequent governor, Mir Mannu. And Ahmad Shah Abdali perpetrated what we in Sikh parlance call the Vadaka Lukara, or the Great Massacre. During one military action, it is estimated that roughly 40% of the Sikh population, including a large number of women and children, were massacred. Similarly, Lakhpat Rai, the governor's deputy in Lahore, perpetrated the Chota Ka Lukara, or the small massacre, in which thousands perished as well. Mir Mannu was known for attacking women, children, mercilessly torturing Sikhs. In the Sikh context, we have a communal prayer known as the Ardas. Whenever Sikhs gather to pray, no matter what the occasion, whether the occasion is a happy one, such as a wedding or the marking of a child's birth, or if it's a sad and solemn occasion, such as someone's passing, the same Ardas is read in the congregation. An important section of the Ardas commemorates all of the innocent Sikhs who perished in the violence of the 18th century. So when somebody asks me, why will Sikhs not forget 1984? I go back to the history of the 18th century and the Ardas. And the question that I ask in response is, if Sikhs refuse to forget those innocents who were massacred more than 200 years ago, then why will they forget those innocents who were massacred 40 years ago? Are they any less worthy of being remembered? Of course, it's a rhetorical question. So asking this question betrays a lack of an understanding of the Sikh ethos. Our struggles are precious to us. The memory of those struggles is precious to us. It's an important part of our being. And just like the Sikhs who suffered in the 18th century will never be forgotten, similarly, the Sikhs who suffered in 1984 will never be forgotten, because that is part of our ethos. Where does this ethos come from? We go back to the early 1500s. Guru Nanak Sahib, the founder of the Sikh faith, has made his great journey to Mecca, and he is returning home. He comes back via the land route. He reaches Punjab, visits a small village called Sayyidpur, which falls in modern-day Pakistan. That area is now called Aminabad. One of his beloved disciples, a humble carpenter called Lalo, lives in Aminabad or Sayyidpur. When Guru Nanak Sahib gets to Sayyidpur, he sees a terrible sight. There are bodies piled up everywhere, blood, the streets are awash with blood, women are wailing. He learns that Sayyidpur has been attacked by a powerful warlord. The name of the warlord is Babur, and he is from Uzbekistan. Like many other invaders before him, he is eyeing the riches of Hindustan. He will go on to establish the mighty Mughal dynasty, but he's not the Mughal emperor yet. Guru Nanak takes in the fearful sight that he sees in Sayyidpur, and a cry of anguish and rage erupts from within. In the Sikh tradition, we call this cry of rage Babar Bani, or Bani, or the writings, or the words that Guru Nanak addressed to Babur. In this powerful collection of hymns, Guru Nanak takes Babur to task, excoriates him, heaps shame on him for attacking innocents and killing innocents. And thus, Guru Nanak establishes an important tradition in the Sikh faith, the tradition of standing up to injustice and tyranny, no matter what the cost. Decades pass, centuries pass, this tradition becomes firmly ingrained in the psyche and the ethos of the followers of Guru Nanak, the Sikhs. The fifth Sikh Guru, Guru Arjan, is tortured and put to death by the Emperor Jahangir. We don't have time to get into the complicated history, but suffice it to say that Guru Arjan is living that same principle that Guru Nanak Sahib espoused with Babar Bani. His son, Guru Hargobind, raises an army after Guru Arjan is tortured and killed, and has several confrontations with the Mughal Empire, with the Emperor Shah Jahan, once again standing on that principle. Guru Hargobind's son, the ninth Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur, goes to Delhi to remonstrate with Aurangzeb and to advocate for the religious rights of Kashmiri Brahmins who have come to him because Iftikhar Khan, the governor of Kashmir, is intent on forcibly converting them to Islam. And for his endeavors, Guru Tegh Bahadur is beheaded. Once again, he is standing for that same principle. His son, Guru Gobind Singh, the 10th Sikh Guru, sacrifices his entire family as he stands once again for the principle tyranny must be opposed, no matter what the consequences or the cost. The Sikhs of the 18th century live that same principle. That is why the Vada Kalukara happens, the Chota Kalukara, the two Holocausts happen. When any invader, be it Nadir Shah, be it Ahmad Shah Abdali, be it Taimur Shah, as they retreat, the Sikhs are the only power in Punjab who harass them, harry them, free their captives, take their captives home, once again living the principle that was espoused by Guru Nanak in Babar Bani. So this has been the Sikh response to tyranny from the time of Guru Nanak. Sikhs are known for this, but oftentimes when we think about Sikh warriors and the fight for righteousness, we think about Guru Gobind Singh. We don't think about Guru Nanak, but the principle actually originated from Guru Nanak when he refused to accept the terrible things that Babur had perpetrated. How does the Sikh community move forward? What does all of this mean? And is there any hope when it comes to breaking the cycle of sectarian violence which shows no signs of going away. I mean, just look around you. India, the Middle East, various parts of Europe, the same cycle continues. It just will not stop. As a Sikh, I go back to the ethos of Guru Nanak to search for an answer to the question, how do we move forward? How do we break the cycle of violence? It's instructive to examine some of the lines of Babar Bani, the powerful words that Guru Nanak spoke to Babar fearlessly. So there's one particular hymn in which Guru Nanak likens the massacre to a macabre, bloody wedding. Paap ki janjale kabulo dhaya jodi mange gyan ve lalo. So he's addressing his beloved Lalo and says, this bridegroom has come with his wedding party of sin, and he wants the entire country as his dowry. And then Guru Nanak Sahib goes ahead and documents the anguish of the people. Musalmaniya pade kateba kasht mein kare khudaye ve lalo. So he says, Muslim women are wailing. They read the Quran and they address Allah. And then he says, Jat sanati hor hindwaniya evi lekhe laye ve lalo. Khoon ke sohle gaviye nanak rat ka kungu paye ve lalo. Then he says, Hindu women, whether they are so-called low-born or high-born, they are all wailing in anguish. What does all of this mean? Guru Nanak is not talking about the anguish of his followers, the Sikhs. He is talking about the anguish of humanity. That is the worldview of Guru Nanak. And that is what has to inform the response to 1984. Because Guru Nanak feels the pain of the entire world. That's the reason why he specifically mentions the pain of Muslim women, the pain of Hindu women, when he talks about the massacre of Sayyidpur. It's unremarkable to cry out when we are hurt or when we are in pain. It's a natural instinct. All of us cry out when we are in pain. Guru Nanak taught us to cry out when someone else is in pain. That is how you break the cycle of violence. If only we can embrace this aspect of the ethos of Guru Nanak and his worldview and find it in our hearts to feel pain when somebody else is hurt, that is our best opportunity to stop this cycle of violence. That is what the teachings of Guru Nanak bring to us. And that is what has informed my personal response to 1984 and all of the other 1984s that have happened since, and unfortunately the ones that are going to happen in the future, because there are no signs that this cycle is about to be broken anytime soon. The Sikh ethos is unequivocal in its condemnation of tyranny and its opposition to tyranny. It also has no room for vengeance. Because I teach, because I mentor young people, particularly young Sikhs in the diaspora, I always am very careful to make the point that in our response to 1984, we should never descend into hatred or a desire for revenge. And this is just not the 1984 of the Sikhs. This applies to all the 1984s that we are faced with as humanity. We have to be dispassionate. We have to be mindful. We have to be specific. But we have to always recognize that there is a line between justice and revenge. We have to absolutely, unequivocally commit to the fight for justice, but it can never be allowed to descend into a desire for revenge. That is what the ethos of Guru Nanak dictates to me as a Sikh. So, in conclusion, as we ponder these questions 40 years after the violence of 1984, it's important to remember that the Sikhs will never forget 1984. The victims of 1984 will be remembered hundreds of years from now, just like the victims of the turbulent 18th century are. The Sikh response to tyranny has always been very measured, very ethical, and response to this 1984 and other 94s needs to be absolutely, absolutely rooted in that. Which brings me to the final section of today's conversation before we open it to any questions. The Night of the Restless Spirits, my collection of short fiction, tries to examine 1984 through many different lenses from different perspectives, keeping in focus the aspect of Guru Nanak's ethos that I just shared with you. Terrible things happened to 1984 is, of course, an important theme, but there's much more to the events of that bloody year than just this one narrative. Stories need to be told about those fearless of course, stories of Sikhs who suffered need to be told and have been told and will be told. It's also important to tell the stories of those non-Sikhs who fearlessly put their lives, their livelihoods, and their families at risk to try and save Sikh lives. So some of these stories are told in this collection of short fiction as well. Today, I will read a couple of pages from the title story in the collection. It's called Night of the Restless Spirits. So again, because most of you are young and you probably don't have much knowledge of these events, in June 1984, the Golden Temple or the Sri Harmandir Sahib was not the only Gurdwara that was attacked. 40 other Gurdwaras were attacked in an operation titled Operation Woodrose. And this story is set during a massacre that occurred at Dukh Nivaran Sahib in Patiala, which was also attacked as part of Operation Woodrose. He lies with his face down in the dust, his white beard matted, and the last few strands of hair sticky with blood. Flies buzz around the red blotches on his chest and belly. His once proud turban is now a shapeless rag dyed a new color. He can't feel the pain anymore, just a dull throbbing sensation and the sticky wetness. He wishes his last thoughts could be different. He would like to say the Sodar once again, but he cannot collect his thoughts. The Sodar is part of the Sikh daily regimen of prayer. It's verses that are read in the evening. Each time he tries to mouth the first verse, his thoughts disintegrate into visions of violence and anger and discord. His frail old body gathers strength only to tremble in rage and lie still again. What is left of Hukam Singh lies by him, between him and the marble wall richly adorned in red. Hukam Singh's hands are tied behind his back with his saffron keski. The last of the old school grand raggis, he lives and breathes rags and gurbani. His voice is old and cracked, and it trembles, but every note is crystal clear and touches the basest of hearts. Hukam Singh's last performance is over, and what a performance! His Jodidar, who accompanies him on the tabla, has fled. But the LMGs that the Javans carry sound like a perfectly tuned tabla. How sweetly the guns sound the kerwa. Dinakatinakadin, dinakatinakadin. The fool of a Jodidar could never play the kerwa right. He should have been here to listen to the soldiers. Hukam Singh's last performance is unusual. There is no Mangla Charan and no Alap today. There is no time spent tuning the tanpura and the tabla. And instead of sitting down and whispering in undertones, the congregation is calm. Hukam Singh, the perfectly timed kerwa begins on the guns, and in an unbecoming and ungainly display, the congregation twitches and jerkily dances to the beat. And then Hukam Singh's voice joins in joyous celebration of the rhythm. His voice soars to the sky in a wonderful new rag, rising and falling in ornate, gamak embellished tans, effortlessly spanning tens of octaves, expanding until the Gurdwara, then the village, and then the entire Punjab echoes the sound of the furious melody crafted so carefully by the widow and her gleeful kerwa pounding divisions. No longer a Sikh, but now a Sufi, dancing, dancing in agony and unholy ecstasy as each beat pierces his enormous body, which is a magnet that sucks in their molten lead, and the rag comes out stronger and louder through every new mouth. It stops as suddenly as it begins. The last few notes bubble out of Hukam Singh's body and drip onto the old man's face. The congregation has stopped its undignified, jerky dance and is sleeping, silent and sated. The widow's musicians have taken their music and have left, searching for another audience. So I'll stop here and I'll turn it over to the moderator in case there are any questions.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful, really, really, really wonderful personal experience and lecture. I can't express with enough gratitude for the truly extraordinary lecture. It was far more than, just an academic discourse. It was a deeply enriching and transformative experience. The way you wove together history, personal insights, profound narratives was nothing short of mesmerizing. Every word carried wisdom, and every story you shared resonated deeply, leaving us, with a newfound appreciation for the subject. Now I will happy to start the question and answer session to our audience in Facebook. I can see a lot of questions here. So I will take some questions from the platform. So, sir, can I begin the session?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Thank you, sir. With your permission, sir, I will ask our first question. It's asked by Rakhi Mondol. She's asking that how do we understand the violence of 1984 not as an anomaly but as a logical extension of the Indian state's post-colonial crisis, a state that had repeatedly used violence to suppress dissent, that Telangana, Naxalbari, Northeast, and Punjab.
So I am no scholar and no academic. I will answer this simply from my personal perspective. I think the question is almost a rhetorical one because we know that the state has constantly, through our history, used violence with impunity whenever there has been a need to either suppress dissent or to achieve a particular political objective. This was no exception. So, yes, I absolutely agree that this is very much part of a pattern.
Thank you, sir. So now we will take another question. It's asked by Anirban Dash. He's asking that how do we explain the non-retaliation of Sikhs at a mass level in the immediate aftermath of the pogrom? Does this challenge conventional theories of communal riots where both groups engage in violence?
Fantastic question. And this is something that we should be pondering as we talk about the events of 1984. I will just say this. I made a point earlier about, the humanity of the common man being alive and well, which I discovered personally. I'll give you a little anecdote. Our performance of Kultar's Mime in Chennai was on a weeknight, on a Thursday night, and the venue was out of the town. So I was anticipating that maybe 4 people will show up. I had a couple of personal friends from college in Chennai, the organizers. I was expecting an audience of, 10 people. More than 300 people, standing room only. And when I looked around, I discovered that there were probably 10 Sikhs in the audience. The rest of the audience was non-Sikh. As I said earlier, their response was no different. The same tears, the same empathy. What does this tell us? This tells us that if we step away from the hateful rhetoric of those who seek to divide us, our humanity will always come to the forefront. To specifically answer this excellent question that was asked, there are a couple of reasons why there was no retaliatory violence. One of them is that at the end of the day, unless there is an external stimulus, unless we are incited and we lose our minds, our humanity teaches us to behave in certain ways. And that is how the Sikhs of Punjab behaved in the face of tremendous provocation. It is not for me to suggest that the Sikhs are blessed with a larger sense of humanity than people from other faiths. Far from it, not at all. But what I will say is that this is what the ethos of the Sikh gurus teaches us. Revenge is unacceptable. I'm a storyteller. I will tell you a tiny little story in this context, which will help you understand why there was no retaliation in Punjab. Guru Hargobind, the 6th Guru of the Sikhs, after his father was tortured and killed at the orders of the Emperor Jahangir, raised an army. And as I said, fought several battles with the Emperor Shah Jahan and his lieutenants. The Sikh Guru attracted many followers to his side. One of them was a young Pathan by the name of Pende Khan, in whom the Guru recognized great potential. The Guru nurtured Pende Khan. A lot of Sikhs were very upset because they felt that Pende Khan was being pampered. He was given the best food, the best training, and he grew up to become one of the most formidable warriors in the ranks of Guru Hargobind's army. Decades passed. Pende Khan became arrogant. And Pende Khan thought that the Guru derives his power from me. And when he acted in an arrogant manner, the Guru dismissed him from his court. Pende Khan immediately crossed over to the Mughals, who were readying to attack the Guru once again, and essentially said, look, the Guru got all of his strength from me. Now that I have defected, he can be easily defeated. The Mughals attacked. with Pandey Khan in their ranks, there was a fierce battle in which the Mughal army was defeated. Pandey Khan challenged the Guru to hand combat. They fought, and the Guru mortally wounded Pandey Khan. So Pandey Khan is lying in the dust. He's about to die. The Guru approaches him, and the Guru says to Pandey Khan, your end is near. You should recite the Kalma now. And Pandey Khan responds to the Guru and says, "Oh Guru, your sword is my Kalma." And the Guru starts crying. He takes Pandey Khan's head in his lap and he cries. That is the power of forgiveness. And that is an ethos that comes directly from Guru Nanak again. This was the reason why these stories are ingrained in the soul of every Sikh. And it is this ethos that prevented terrible things from happening in the aftermath of 1984 in areas where the Sikhs were dominant. Sorry for that long answer. I'm a storyteller. I tend to tell stories.
Thank you, sir, for the story, sir. I can also remember one story is written by Kartar Singh Duggal. It was translated into my vernacular language, Bengali. The story, the tale was there was a disciple of Guru Nanak named Mardana who was very thirsty, and he went to I think his name was Kafir. So, but he didn't give the water, and then again he came back to Nanak. Nanak again sent him off, and again, after 3 or 4 times, Nanak just pulled off a stone, and then the water came from here. And the story against to the second part where the Sikhs in our national, there was a train was running from Delhi to Mumbai, and in the train, our freedom fighters were very thirsty and hungry, but the Britishers didn't give them the food. But the old Sikhs lied on the rail track to stop the train. So it was that story. So if I say that this community in quote has a wonderful history for their kindness and my kind of virtue in their history.
Thank you.
So now I will take another question from our Facebook. It's asked by Mariam Begum. So she is asking that how do we read the role of the judiciary in normalizing impunity, especially given that major preparators like Sajjan Kumar and Jagdish Titler evade justice for decades?
So the judiciary didn't exactly cover itself with glory either in the official response to 1984. Commission after commission essentially whitewashed what had happened. You know, those of you who are familiar with the history will know that Harvinder Singh Fulka was one of the attorneys in the Delhi High Court who fearlessly fought for the rights of the victims. So absolutely the judiciary, in a certain sense, has been complicit in terms of denying justice to the victims.
Thank you, sir. We'll take our next question, and it's asked by Shantam. He's asking that why is 1984 not officially recognized as a genocide despite fitting the UN definition? Does this expose the limitation of international legal frameworks in addressing state-backed mass violence?
So again, this is a somewhat technical question, which I don't feel empowered to answer with authority. I will say this, though. India was ruled by the Congress Party for decades after the massacre. And certainly, as the perpetrators, they had no incentive in terms of recognizing this as anything other than a riot. They were the ones who perpetrated the narrative of a riot. The government that took over subsequently had very little incentive to do the same thing either. But I will tell you this. In 2014, the then Home Minister of India, Mr. Rajnath Singh, when he was visiting the so-called widow colony, Tilak Vihar in Delhi, where a lot of the survivors of 1984 had been settled, explicitly for the first time referred to the events of 1984 as genocide. So I cannot speak to international bodies and legal definitions of genocide and so on. The one thing that we absolutely know unequivocally is that what had happened was no riot, it was a massacre. And certainly in a lot of quarters, it is referred to as a pogrom. It is referred to as, the Sikh genocide of 1984. Semantics do matter. I personally tend to characterize the events of 1984 as the Tisra Kalukara in the Punjabi language. So Kalukara is a word which means Holocaust. So we commemorate the two Holocausts that occurred in the 18th century. I call this the third Holocaust that the Sikhs faced.
Thank you, sir. We will take last two questions. There are so many questions also, but there's also some kind of time also.
Sure. And by the way, I'm easy to find on social media. If people want to write to me, they should absolutely feel free to. They can message me, wherever they want to, wherever they can find me. Facebook, Instagram, whatever.
Thank you, sir. Now we'll take that question. It's asked by Oiko Banerjee. It's asking that what are the limitations of journalistic accounts and survivor testimonies in reconstructing the events of 1984? Do they risk personalizing a broader political and structural failure?
So, you're all scholars and you're asking really, really good questions. I can only answer from my personal perspective. I'm a storyteller. I'm not a historian. I'm not a social scientist. For me, these individual narratives are tremendously important because otherwise, these instances of violence simply get reduced to statistics. Statistics will never convey the anguish and the pain that was suffered. And in my mind, fiction in particular is a really, really important vehicle for documenting these alternate histories, if you will, which are never going to find their way into history books. Often when I'm talking about 1984, I go back to one of my favorite novels, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And it's a fabulous, rich book, which has many things to commend it. But the one thing that I always go back to, which has been an inspiration to me in my own writing, is the author's characterization of a massacre of banana company workers, where he talks about the tremendous violence that the workers are subjected to, and then talks about an even bigger tragedy or travesty as the memory of this massacre is removed from the collective consciousness of the people. So to me, focusing on these individual stories, these tales of survival, these tales of pain, this is one way of ensuring that these massacres and these periods of trauma are not relegated either to statistics or are not wiped from collective memory.
Thank you, sir. We will take our last question from our Facebook. Is asked by one of our core member, Iman Hussain. He's asking that did the media play a role in manufacturing consent for the violence through its framing of Sikhs as, in quote, anti-national in the years leading up to 1984? Why were some Sikh groups, such as Nirankaris, largely spared in the violence, whereas mainstream Sikh communities faced targeted, in quote, attacks?
So the media was absolutely complicit. There is no doubt about this. And you know what? This is a very relevant point that somebody has raised. You have to understand that the media is always manipulated by the powerful as they seek to perpetrate their own interests. In 1984, leading up to the attack on the Sri Harmandir Sahib, it was really convenient for the then government, the government of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, to characterize Sikhs as violent separatists because it created the context for her and her party to take actions that were intended to save the nation from a grave threat. So the construction of grave threats is a mechanism that has been used by the powerful since time immemorial, oftentimes focusing on a particular minority to try and reap political benefits. And the media absolutely played along. I mean, it's really very interesting to find mainstream, well-respected media outlets today, both India and international, who look at the events of 1984, particularly June 1984, through the lens of this propaganda and falsehood. There is often the justification for Operation Blue Star, for instance, is often the Sikhs were waging a separatist insurgency and they wanted to carve out their own nation. Not true at that time. Subsequently, after the Sarbat Khalsa of 1986, there was such a movement. But in 1984, when the Golden Temple was attacked, there was no such movement. The media knows that. Subsequently, senior RAW operatives, most notably GBS Sidhu, who wrote a book on the subject, have talked how the political situation was manipulated by the then government to create this perception that there was a great risk to the nation from the Sikhs so that they could act decisively in a very cynical political move designed to get them benefits during the next election. That was the garbage that was going on in 1984, and the media was absolutely complicit. There is no doubt about that.
Thank you, sir. So there are so many questions also left, but as I say, and as I also say, and you can ask the questions on that. You can so many questions and comments left in our Facebook channel, but again, we have to in this session. We feel incredibly fortunate to have had the opportunity to learn from you, sir. Your generosity in sharing your knowledge and personal experiences and the journey is truly inspiring, and we are humbled by the depth of your scholarship. Also, thank you for your time, for your invaluable insights, and for making this session so memorable, sir. We will cherish this experience and look forward to more such enlightening sessions in the future. And we wish for the best of your upcoming book and all the books you've written. So thank you, sir, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It was absolutely a pleasure. There is nothing that I enjoy more than interacting with bright young people. I often travel to India, and I always make it a point to visit Kolkata. So the next time I'm there, I would love to meet with you and several of your colleagues face to face as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.